What would you risk for glory? Imagine standing at the foot of the world's most dangerous mountain, knowing that one wrong step could erase you forever. In 1939, an American expedition set out to conquer K2, the savage peak no one had ever tamed. But what happened on those icy slopes would become one of the darkest, most haunting chapters in mountaineering history. Welcome to K2 Stories, and if you think you know about mountain tragedies, think again. The year was 1939. The world was on the brink of war, but for a small group of Americans, another battle was calling. Not on a battlefield, but on the icy ridges of the Karakoram. At 8,611 meters, K2 stood like a jagged pyramid stabbing into the sky. Unlike Everest, which had been attempted many times by British teams, K2 was still cloaked in mystery. To climbers, it wasn't just a mountain. It was the mountain, the one that whispered promises of immortality, but demanded blood in return. At the heart of this dream was Fritz Wiesner, a German-born American climber with a reputation for audacity. Known for scaling impossible rock walls in the Alps and America, Wiesner carried a quiet obsession: to plant the American flag on the top of K2. To him, this wasn't just about climbing. It was about proving that the United States, a young nation in mountaineering terms, could stand shoulder to shoulder with Europe's elite explorers. But no man climbs an 8,000-meter giant alone. Wiesner began to assemble his team, and the roster itself would later become a source of both brilliance and disaster. Among them was Dudley Wolfe, a wealthy New Yorker in his 50s, inexperienced at high altitude, but eager to buy his way into adventure. Then there were the Sherpas, hardy men from Darjeeling, essential for carrying loads and guiding the route. And lastly, a mix of American climbers, some skilled, some less so, each with their own reasons for joining. As the caravan wound its way through Pakistan, the climbers marveled at the landscapes. Valleys carved by ice, roaring rivers, and peaks that seemed to pierce the heavens. But every step closer to K2 also meant stepping deeper into isolation. Finally, after weeks of grueling travel, they stood before the mountain itself. Imagine their first sight of K2. Its massive black pyramid rising into the clouds, its slopes streaked with avalanches, its ridges sharp as knives. Climbers often describe K2 not as beautiful, but as terrifying. And yet, that terror was exactly what drew them. They established base camp on the Godwin-Austen Glacier, a barren sea of ice where tents flapped in the thin wind. From here, every move would be a gamble, setting higher camps, ferrying supplies, and inching their way upward toward the summit. From the very first rotations up the mountain, cracks in the expedition began to show. Wolfe struggled badly with the altitude, often lagging behind. The Sherpas, though strong, grew uneasy at the lack of clear leadership. And among the Americans, rivalries and mistrust simmered quietly. Wiesner, however, pressed forward with astonishing determination. He pushed the team higher and higher, convinced that success was within reach. And to his credit, the climb did make extraordinary progress. By July, they had reached heights no one had ever achieved on K2 before. But the higher they went, the more dangerous everything became. Supplies dwindled. Weather windows slammed shut without warning, and behind it all loomed the silent weight of the mountain, demanding total respect or exacting fatal punishment. Wiesner's vision of glory began to collide with the messy, human reality of exhaustion, fear, and fractured teamwork. And on the horizon, a deadly storm was waiting. The 1939 American expedition was not simply a climb. It was a collision course: ambition versus nature, leadership versus chaos, and glory versus tragedy. And soon, by mid-July of 1939, the American team had already gone further than anyone before them on K2. They had carved a path up the steep ridges, establishing a chain of camps that reached astonishing heights. For the first time in history, human beings stood within striking distance of the summit of K2. And yet, Even as the dream glittered above them, the cracks in the team deepened. One of the greatest sources of concern was Dudley Wolfe. Wealthy, confident, and stubborn, Wolfe had insisted on joining the expedition despite his lack of high-altitude experience. On the lower slopes, he managed to keep up, but as the altitude increased, his body betrayed him. He grew slower, weaker, and often disoriented. At camps high on the mountain, Wolfe struggled even to perform the simplest tasks. The Sherpas, whose judgment was crucial, began to whisper doubts. Carrying supplies for a man who could barely move on his own seemed not just difficult, but dangerous. Some American climbers questioned why Wolfe had been allowed to come at all. But Wiesner, committed to his vision of unity, refused to abandon him. To leave Wolfe behind would tarnish the expedition, perhaps even doom its reputation. Thus, Wolfe was carried higher and higher, each step becoming more desperate. Wiesner, meanwhile, pressed forward with relentless drive. His own strength at altitude was remarkable. He seemed to thrive where others gasped for air. By late July, he and a Sherpa climber named Pasang Dawa Lama had reached incredible heights, within just a few hundred meters of the summit itself. Imagine that moment. Two men alone on the shoulder of K2, staring upward at the final pyramid of ice and rock. The summit was right there, a glittering prize that had lured generations of climbers but had never been touched. Wiesner believed they could make it. Pasang, however, felt the risk was too great. Clouds were building, supplies were thin, and the mountain seemed restless. Pasang begged Wiesner to turn back. Reluctantly, Wiesner listened. As July turned to August, the weather collapsed. A storm pinned climbers in their tents, burying camps in snow and cutting off visibility. Days dragged into weeks. Supplies dwindled. Tempers frayed. Communication between camps began to fail. Some climbers descended to lower altitudes for safety, while others stayed high, trapped in the storm. The expedition was no longer a unified force. It was a scattered group of individuals, each trying to survive in his own way. Wolfe, stranded at one of the high camps, became a desperate problem. Unable to descend on his own, he relied entirely on the Sherpas. But the Sherpas were exhausted, and their patience was wearing thin. They had not come to die on the mountain for a man who could not climb. By early August, the situation had spiraled into chaos. Wiesner himself was forced down the mountain, heartbroken but alive. Other climbers retreated, shaken by frostbite and exhaustion. But Wolfe remained, marooned high above in the death zone. The Sherpas tried, more than once, to bring him down, but each time the effort ended in failure. Wolfe refused to abandon his tent, refused to admit he could not go on. Some accounts suggest he became irrational, insisting that he could wait out the storm and rejoin the climb. But on K2, time is not a friend. Every day at altitude drained strength. Every storm erased hope. When the skies finally cleared, Wolfe was still up there, alone. The others, faced with their own survival, made a fateful choice. They descended, leaving Wolfe behind. It was an unthinkable decision, but perhaps an inevitable one. To save one man, they risked losing everyone. The mountain had claimed its first victim. Dudley Wolfe, wealthy adventurer, became the first American to die on K2. His body would remain frozen high on the slopes, a grim reminder of ambition turned fatal. But the tragedy of 1939 was not yet over. The chaos of the descent, the fractures in leadership, and the moral burden of when the storm finally lifted in early August, the American team faced a horrifying truth. Dudley Wolfe was still up there, stranded in the death zone. He had survived the blizzard, but only barely. His tent clung to the slope like a fragile shell, and inside Wolfe was weak, half frozen, yet still refusing to come down on his own. For Fritz Wiesner, it was a crushing dilemma. The summit was lost, the expedition fractured, but Wolfe was alive, and that meant responsibility. To abandon him outright was unthinkable. and so began one of the most desperate rescue efforts in mountaineering history. The American climbers themselves were exhausted, many already retreating to the safety of lower altitudes. Wiesner turned to the Sherpas, the backbone of the expedition, men like Pasang Dawa Lama, Pasang Kikuli, and Finsu had already risked their lives countless times ferrying loads. Now they were asked to attempt the impossible, climb back into the death zone to save a man who could not save himself. It was an extraordinary act of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. The Sherpas knew the risks better than anyone. They understood that at 7,500 meters, even a small delay could mean death. But their code of duty, and perhaps their respect for Wiesner, pushed them upward once more. The first rescue attempt came with grim determination. A small team of Sherpas battled their way back up the icy ridges, carrying extra food, ropes, and the faint hope of bringing Wolf down. They reached his tent and found him alive, but weak, disoriented, and unwilling to move. They begged him to descend. They offered to carry him, but Wolf resisted, insisting he could wait, that he could recover. The Sherpas tried to coax him, but the weather began to shift again. With storms brewing, they had no choice but to leave, promising to return. It was a decision that tore at their hearts. To descend without him felt like betrayal, but to stay was suicide. Days later, true to their word, the Sherpas climbed again. This time the weather was even worse. Avalanches roared in the distance, snow choked the air, yet still they fought upward, their bodies battered, lungs screaming. When they reached Wolf's tent, they found him weaker still, nearly incapable of standing. Again they pleaded. Again Wolf refused. Whether from pride, delusion, or sheer stubbornness, he clung to the fantasy that he could endure. This time the Sherpas tried to drag him down by force, but Wolf collapsed, unable to continue. The thin air suffocated every effort. Once more, with night falling and their own lives hanging by a thread, the Sherpas retreated. They knew the truth. Wolf's fate was sealed. Incredibly, the Sherpas prepared for one last try. This time, 3 men set out, Pasang Kikuli, Finsu, and Pasang Lama. They carried ropes, food, and the desperate determination to do what no one else could. But the mountain had other plans. Somewhere high on the slopes, in the raging storm, tragedy struck. None of the 3 Sherpas ever returned. Whether swept away by avalanche, swallowed by crevasses, or simply frozen in the storm, their bodies vanished into the vast silence of K2. They had given everything, courage, loyalty, and ultimately their lives, in a futile attempt to save another. For the survivors at lower camps, the news was devastating. They had lost not just Wolf, but 3 of their strongest Sherpas. The expedition was broken, its spirit shattered. Wiesner himself was left carrying unbearable guilt. He had come to K2 to bring glory to America, to prove that the summit could be conquered. Instead, he left with 4 dead men behind him and a story that would stain his reputation forever. Some blamed Wiesner for pushing too hard, for poor leadership, for refusing to abandon Wolf earlier. Others blamed Wolf, whose arrogance and refusal to descend had dragged the Sherpas into catastrophe. Still others saw it as the inevitable price of challenging the world's most savage mountain. But one truth remained clear. The 1939 American expedition had ended in tragedy, not triumph. In the years that followed, climbers would still find relics of that doomed attempt. Tattered remnants of tents, pieces of equipment, even traces of Wolf's camp high on the mountain. Each discovery was a ghostly reminder of the cost of ambition. K2 had spoken with merciless clarity. It was not a mountain to be tamed, not by wealth, not by pride, not by sheer determination. Those who climbed in 1939 left behind a message written in ice and blood. On K2, nature always has the final word. The first signs of the storm came not with thunder, but with silence. An eerie stillness descended on the mountain, as if K2 itself were holding its breath. The sky darkened with unsettling speed, clouds swirling like an ominous cauldron above the climbers. One of the Sherpas muttered a warning in his native tongue. "Bad spirits are awake." By late afternoon, the wind struck without mercy. Gusts roared through the ridges like freight trains, tearing at tents and ropes. Snow whipped into their faces, slicing like knives. The climbers huddled in Camp 4, their world reduced to the canvas walls of the tent and the howling beyond. For hours, they listened to the storm claw at them, each gust a reminder of how small and fragile they were in the jaws of the Karakoram. Weissner tried to steady morale. "This will pass," he told them, though doubt gnawed at his words. Yet as night fell, the storm only grew fiercer. Temperatures plummeted to deadly lows, and the men's breath froze in their beards. Inside the tent, frost formed on their sleeping bags, as if the mountain had crept inside to claim them. When dawn finally arrived, it brought little relief. Visibility was near zero, the world outside a white blur. Movement was impossible. To step out was to vanish. They were trapped, high on the most dangerous mountain on Earth, supplies dwindling by the hour. Food was rationed, matches counted, every decision weighed against survival. By the third day, panic began to creep in. The radio crackled with static, useless against the fury of the storm. Some of the Sherpas whispered of descending, but Weissner knew retreat was suicide in such conditions. They had no choice but to endure. Then came the cruelest blow. One of the climbers, exhausted and delirious from altitude, stumbled outside during the night. He never returned. In the morning, his tracks disappeared into the white void. No one dared follow. The mountain had claimed him. The loss shook the team deeply. They buried their grief in silence, each man retreating into his own thoughts. Fear now sat among them like a seventh member of the party. And yet, amid the despair, Weissner's resolve hardened. He whispered to himself, "We must go higher, or we will die here anyway." When the storm finally began to ease after days of torment, the team was gaunt, frost-bitten, and emotionally broken. But Weissner was right about one thing. To survive, they had to move. The mountain gave no mercy for hesitation, and so, battered but unbroken, the survivors prepared for what lay ahead, knowing the hardest trials were yet to come.
The storm had left them shattered, but alive, and on K2 survival was already a victory. Yet Weissner was haunted by a different truth. They had come to climb, not merely endure. His obsession with the summit burned brighter now, even as his team teetered on the edge of collapse. On the morning after the storm, with skies finally clearing, Weissner announced his plan. "We go higher. The mountain will not defeat us." His words cut through the silence of exhausted men, both inspiring and terrifying. Some nodded with grim determination. Others lowered their eyes, unwilling to follow. The climb resumed, painfully slow. Each step was a battle against thin air and battered bodies. Sherpas staggered under loads that felt heavier with every meter. Fingers blackened by frostbite refused to grip ropes. And yet step by step they climbed, like shadows moving against the monstrous wall of ice and rock. At 26,000 feet, just below the death zone, disaster struck again. Fritz Weissner and Pasang Lama, the strongest Sherpa, pressed ahead toward the summit while others lagged behind. Hours later, they realized the rest of the team had turned back. Wiesner and Pasang stood alone, staring at the final ridge, the summit glistening in unreachable clarity above them. It was within reach, so close that Wiesner swore he could smell the wind off the top. But Pasang, gasping and trembling, refused to continue. "If we go higher, we die," he said firmly. Wiesner pleaded, cursed, even begged, but Pasang did not move. The mountain loomed silent, indifferent to ambition. Defeated, Wiesner had no choice but to retreat. That night back at camp, his silence was heavier than any storm. The dream of becoming the first American to conquer K2 had evaporated just yards from success. And worse, the team was fracturing beyond repair. Supplies dwindled, spirits broke, and the descent became a nightmare. One by one, men faltered. One Sherpa slipped on an icy slope and vanished into the abyss, his scream cut short by endless silence. Another collapsed from exhaustion, never to rise again. Each loss was a scar on Wiesner's soul, a reminder that the mountain demanded payment for every step. By the time the survivors stumbled down to the lower camps, the American expedition was in ruins. They had not reached the summit. They had not returned whole. Of the brave men who had dared K2, only a shattered few remained. When Fritz Wiesner finally returned to the United States, he was greeted not with glory, but with whispers. Many blamed him for pushing too hard, for sacrificing men to ambition. Others defended him, calling it the price of exploring the unknown. But one truth was undeniable. The 1939 American K2 expedition had become one of mountaineering's greatest tragedies. And yet, within that tragedy lies a haunting legacy. They showed the world what it meant to stand against the impossible. They revealed the razor's edge between glory and doom. And they proved that K2 does not belong to man. It never will. Even today, nearly a century later, climbers speak of Wiesner's near summit with a mix of awe and sorrow. K2 took lives, shattered dreams, and carved scars into history. But it also whispered a lesson, that on the world's most dangerous mountain, survival itself is a triumph. So when you look up at K2's towering peak, remember this story. Not of conquest, but of sacrifice. Not of victory, but of endurance. The mountain stands, eternal and indifferent, and we, mere mortals, can only hope to touch it before it reminds us who truly holds the power. This was the 1939 American expedition to K2, a journey that ended not at the summit, but in tragedy. A story of courage, obsession, and loss. And on this channel, K2 Stories, we will continue to uncover the forgotten tales of the world's most perilous places. If this story shook you, if it made you feel the weight of the mountain in your chest, then join us. Subscribe to K2 Stories, share this tale, and let's keep alive the voices of those who never came back. Because sometimes the greatest stories are not about reaching the top, but about what the mountain takes along the way.